everyone, welcome. Dinsha, welcome. So we are so excited to have joining us virtually today for the CDRL seminar, Professor Mukulika Banerjee from the London School of Economics, where she was the inaugural director of the South Asia Centre from 2015 to 2020, and an associate professor in social anthropology. She studied in Delhi and Oxford and taught at Oxford and UCL before joining LSE, and her books include Why India Votes, The Pathan Unarmed, and the Sari. She is currently editor of Muslim Portraits, and her monograph, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India, was published by Oxford University Press in 2021, and that's what she'll be speaking about today. A few quick housekeeping things for those of us joining on Zoom. Please, thank you for joining us, and use the Q&A box at the bottom to enter in your questions, and we'll try to get to them during Q&A. Today, we'll wrap up at around 12:30, so if we'll take questions from the room, and if everyone here could introduce yourself first so that Professor Banerjee knows who you are, that would be great. And next week, we are changing the seminar date from Thursday, because President Obama is coming, to Tuesday at the same time in the same room with Professor Dan Treisman from UCLA, talking about his book, Spin Dictator. So you'll need to separately register on Zoom for that event or come in person. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Didi, for introducing me, and thank you to Professor Diamond for the invitation, and to all of you for being there. This is a slightly odd scenario where, of course, I can't see you, you can see me, but hopefully we will rub along somehow. This is a little bit like online teaching, which all of us have got used to doing. So I'm going to share my screen, so I'm going to disappear and you'll see my slides. And I think we were going to start just once. Yes. So I was going to start by making some very brief remarks about the state of democracy in India at the moment, which many of you may be following news in India. The state of democracy, both institutionally and culturally, so democratic institutions and democratic culture in India, is under severe assault. There is considerable backsliding, and this is a backsliding that is not just about measuring it against the sort of barometers that we use to measure democratic cultures across the globe, but also to measure India's own democracy against its own record of democracy. So India's democracy 10 years ago compared to India's democracy today is what I am concerned about, especially because I've been studying democratic culture in India since the late 1990s. And on the basis of that, I would say that there has been quite severe backsliding. That's the first point. The second thing to say is that my own research has been located in the eastern state of West Bengal. And West Bengal, as I will hope to show in the next half an hour, is a very good place. It's a good petri dish where to examine how backsliding can occur, how a single party can dominate in the way that we are seeing in India at the moment at the national level by the BJP. But also, I think, a more hopeful message of how this can be stemmed and what is required in order to staunch this hemorrhaging of democratic credentials that India currently is undergoing. So, the points that I'll try and make today these are the broad points that I want you to take away from this talk, so to speak. First thing is, I'm a political anthropologist. So for me, when I study democracy, it is really a study as much of democratic institutions. So the Election Commission of India, for instance, is an institution that I've studied very closely, but also democratic culture. So for me, institutions, the story of institutions and the story of culture go hand in hand, and it is absurd for an anthropologist to study one without the other. As a result, when I study democracy in a village, as I will show you, I was there for elections, of course, and I was also there for when no elections were happening. I was there for those times when there were no elections, but life carried on. And I was interested as much in what happens to democracy and to social life, really, in between elections. Thirdly, the state of West Bengal, which I studied, I cover in this book, Cultivating Democracy, a 15-year period between 1998 and 2013. I continue to return there even after that, but this is the 15-year period I focus on in the book because several key things happen in it. 9 elections happened, and I was doing this fieldwork from a distance. I wasn't in the village for 15 years. I was an academic in London, but going back and forth. But I covered all the major festivals, religious festivals, secular festivals, life crisis rituals that happen in the village over these 15 years. I managed to catch most of them, and you'll see why this is significant. Because that's the fourth point, that the way the book is organized is I look at 4 key events in the village, right? You can write a very descriptive account of the village, but I wasn't interested in doing that. I was writing a book about democracy. And the way I do that is by presenting these 4 key events, each drawn from a different aspect of social life. So a classic anthropological division between political life, economic life, marriage and kinship, and then religious life. So each of these 4 sub areas of social life is where I draw the events from. And the argument that I make that is key is that in order for democracy to flourish, we need robust institutions, of course, but we also need democratic cultures. And in order to create democratic culture, you need democratic values. And these values are produced not just through democratic institutions, but perhaps counterintuitively, they are produced actually in social life itself, in these key ritualistic moments drawn from the economy, from kinship, from religion, and so on. And that's what I'm going to show you, that democratic values are produced in non-political spaces in social life. And that's why we need to pay attention to social organization and social structure when thinking about democratic cultures. And finally, the word cultivating democracy, the word cultivation works at these 2 registers, both as a practice. I'm talking about a very agrarian setting where paddy and wheat are grown. So that allows me to think about the practice of cultivation and its currency it has for creating democratic cultures. And I'll land up at that point to show that really to create democratic culture, you need cultivation. And the opposite of cultivation is not urbanization. In this sense, when I talk about the need to cultivate democracy, cultivation as a practice, as a hope, as a commitment, the opposite of cultivation is complacency. It is taking democracy for granted. And I believe we can talk about this, that the backsliding that we see in so many contexts across the world at the moment is really a result of complacency more than anything else. So let me start by telling you a little bit about West Bengal. I made the point that West Bengal is actually a very good place to study a lot of these issues that I've raised. The big macro story here is that it's an eastern state in India. And if you look at it, this is the state of West Bengal, and it sends 42 members of parliament to the Central National Parliament. If you look at the map of West Bengal through these national level elections, this is what it looks like. This is the story that my book covers, so to speak. So 2004 is, the first big national elections while I'm studying doing my study. And you see the dominance of the color red indicates the dominance of the left front, as it was called. It was a coalition of various left and communist parties, the dominant partner of which was the Communist Party of India Marxist, CPIM, which most people called CPM. And the green that you see, there's one seat in 2004 of the All India Trinamool Congress, that's green on the 2004 map. By 2009, there is a rebalancing, as you can see, of much greater. The blue now is the Trinamool Congress. That's the key one that you've got to take note of. They are the ones in power at the moment. I'll show you in a minute. The CPM is already shrinking by 2009. These are the national level elections. This is not for the government in West Bengal. This is for how many MPs they're sending to the central government. But you can see that the red is already shrinking. The blue is taking over. The green in 2009 is still is the Congress, the grand old party of India. By 2014, Trinamool Congress is pretty much dominating the state. It is sending most of the MPs to Parliament, 34 out of 42. And in 2019, it takes quite a beating from the rising insurgent BJP, in this case. In West Bengal, the BJP, the dominant national party of which Prime Minister Modi is the head, is an insurgent party in West Bengal, because they would like very much to make the government to come into power, to form the government in West Bengal. So if you just look now at the state level, this is what the state assembly looks like, the state government, 294 seats, and this is the changing pattern. So in 2001, it is dominated by the left front. 2006, still huge dominance. By 2011, they are wiped out by Trinamool Congress. By 2016, Trinamool Congress holds, and last year in 2021, Prime Minister Modi and the BJP threw everything in the kitchen sink at that election. Right through COVID and the pandemic, they, as the second wave killed millions of Indians across the country, unrelenting election campaigns were held by Prime Minister Modi in a desperate bid to win this state, and they failed. So they made gains, but they failed to win the election. So there's an interesting story there, because West Bengal has been the site of one-party dominance, as we have seen, for 34 years. 1977 to 2011 was held by the left front. I mean, it's the longest democratically elected communist government anywhere in the world. And this was a party, the CPM was a cadre-based party where you had a comrade in every village, and this capillary network across the state. And the party had come to substitute and insert itself into every aspect of life. And this is what the scholar Bhattacharya calls party society. It had become part of society by this cadre-based party, not dissimilar to what the BJP is like now through its cadres of the RSS. It's not the same organization. It is, the RSS predates the BJP by several decades, but it is the RSS cadres that make victories of the BJP possible. But like I said, the message of hope, depending on where you stand in supporting or not supporting the current politics of India, but the story for democracy, at least, is that change, even at a time when one-party dominance seemed absolutely unending, change did come. And this happened during my fieldwork. It happened while I was going back and forth. When I started in the late 90s, the left front looked invincible in the way that the BJP looks invincible in India today. And yet by 2011, there was this huge rout of the left front. And I was able to see how that rout happened at the very local level. And that's the story I tell in the book. This is also the state that, even though every democratic institution now has been bent by the BJP, the Election Commission of India has been corrupted, electoral expenditure has been made thoroughly opaque, legalized through, the opacity has been legalized through electoral bonds that were introduced through a money bill without any parliamentary debate. So elections in India are no longer what they used to be in the past because they've been institutionally distorted in quite fundamental ways. And yet, despite that, the BJP was unable to win. And so it raises, again, interesting questions about how do you push back against a juggernaut? How do you do that? So West Bengal therefore emerges as this really interesting site to study the distortions of democracy. The left front also dominated not just democratic institutions but democratic culture in quite fundamental ways, but also the sources. We are able to identify some sources of its renewal and to see how cadre-based parties work, what they do to democratic cultures in different places. And I would argue as an anthropologist that we examine these sets of issues at the village level, where it is a manageable scale, where I know everybody in these two villages, where I know everybody's story, and I am able to chart minute changes at the village level over a 15-year period, which shows up as huge changes like the upset at 2011. So I'm going to show you some pictures which are not in the book. So even if you were to buy the book, which I hope you will not have pictures in them. So let me show you some images of what this village looks like where I did my fieldwork. So this is the big road that runs between these two villages. The big compound wall that you see there, the white one, belongs to the local comrade, a very prosperous man during the left front years, and it is the fall of the comrade in as many ways that I chart in the book, and the fall of the comrade is symptomatic of the fall of the left front. So the villages that I call Madanpur and Chishti, and this is what they look like. This is, a fairly really modest, not very prosperous village at all. And this is Chishti. Tanks, rain-fed tanks that are the main sources of water, and bamboo. These are common property resources, and these may be important and come up in our discussion later. Now, I said that the second point, somewhere third or fourth point I made, was about cultivation and what it means. And I just wanted to pause for a minute to think about what it is to study a village where cultivation is the primary economic activity. There's a whole story of the Green Revolution going brown that I tell in the book, and we can talk about it if you're interested. But what made me understand very closely is that cultivation, like say gardening or growing a plant on your windowsill, any of us who have learned to or made ourselves grow something will know that it is a kind of practice that requires you to be a certain kind of person, right? If it hasn't rained in 10 days and you decide to go on holiday and not water your garden, then the plants will die. There is no way that you're going to be able to say, well, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'm sure we can put this off. It's not like the deadline for a paper where you can always negotiate an extension. There is something inviolate in your commitment to cultivation. And I use this idea to explore what it tells us about the nature of our commitments to democracy, because cultivation has precisely those qualities of the sheer tension of whether what you are hoping to grow and reap is going to happen. So every day you're watching the skies, you're looking at the ground, you're looking at the crop, looking out for disease, for pests, and that constant vigilance about what you're trying to nurture and grow, and huge amounts of patience. This is not something that happens. It's not like speeded up cameras where in nature programs where within 5 seconds you go from seed to flower. This is something you've got to wait for it to come to fruition. It is exhausting work. And it's interesting when Didi said Barack Obama will be there on campus next week for you. I remember the speech that he made when President Biden won the elections. And he said in that speech, he said, elections are good. I'm glad everybody's worked hard and people have worked so hard and won this election. But don't forget that work has to carry on. It is exhausting work. Exhausting is the word that he had used for the work in between elections. Don't take your eye off the ball, is what he was saying, and quite rightly too. Look what's happening. But that's another story. It needs care. You can't be disgruntled and grumpy about the fact that you're looking after a plant. You're trying to grow something, and you're always hopeful that all this effort that you're putting in is going to bear fruit. So there is a story of paddy that is in this, and this is an average harvest, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The villages, I should say that where I was working, this is the Imambara of one of the villages. They were mostly Muslim, but there were two low-caste Hindu communities. That's the sort of social demographic of the village. Communist Party was ubiquitous in West Bengal, and I thought you might appreciate seeing these photographs now that it's completely defunct in West Bengal. But this site was absolutely ubiquitous across the state, and inside one of these party offices, this was the pantheon of communist leaders that very typically adorned the walls. Fantastic mural and art on during election campaigns. And then you had always, in the shadow of this great tussle between the left front being unseated by Trinamool Congress, you had the Congress, the original Congress of the mother and the two children, Rahul Gandhi and Priyanka, led by Sonia Gandhi. And that story pretty much continues to this day. And then the insurgent party of Trinamool that I asked you to watch out first in green and then in blue on those maps was led by Mamata Banerjee. Now, again, the riposte from her and the lampooning was fabulous and entertaining for those of us who watch elections closely, and all of that has disappeared. What all of that study of elections certainly showed us was that turnouts in India, and this continues to be the case, they rise with every election. And this is a real puzzle to me. It seemed to me a really interesting and important question to answer. Not just who people were voting for, which is the obsession of political science, but as an anthropologist, I was really curious why people vote. Why are more people voting in every election? What are their expectations? Why are they doing this? And that's what my previous book, Why India Votes, is about. But in this one, what I suggest is that ordinary village life, like the villages that I have just shown you, have the capacity to cultivate democratic values and generate what I call the social imaginaries of democracy, borrowing Charles Taylor's term for it. And I like that term, social imaginaries, because it captures two very important aspects of democratic values in this case, that they're very grounded in the social. They are in social organizations and social ritual, as I show, but also very important, which shares its mood with cultivation, is this idea of imagination, of hope, of being able to imagine what you're trying to create, and that is important in it. So what I show is that in these four events, I told you that I pick four events. The four events that I pick from the realm of marriage and kinship, I pick the event of a scandal between two young, it was based, the scandal was triggered by a young couple who had an affair and and the girl got pregnant. But that wasn't the scandal. This happened all the time, as it does everywhere else. The scandal was actually caused by the comrade who insisted that they be married, that the girl terminate the pregnancy, but they had to get married. And what the scandal was, that it was considered haram in Islam to marry a matrilateral relative a generation above. Between generations on the mother's side, you do not marry your relatives. And that is what caused the scandal. And this scandal was the crossing of a red line by the comrade after his excesses for decades, which people had had to tolerate and were terrified of the violence of the comrade and the party that backed him. What was evident to my eyes as I began to see very carefully, very secretively, an alliance of most unlikely people began to come together to challenge this the scandal that he had caused, that this crossing of the red line that he had done. And so I show, for instance, through my analysis of the scandal that actually what people learned to do was to behave politically. They learned to build alliances, they learned to compromise, they learned to work with people they didn't otherwise agree or like, but they learned to work together. So they had to suppress the agonistic aspects of politics to create the more reparative, the more solidarity creating of potential of politics. The harvest I will return to in a minute because I'll spend more than 30 seconds on that one. The sacrifice, which was Qurbani, the Eid in which you sacrifice cattle, was again an interesting story. These are villages too poor to afford meat the rest of the year. This was the only time when meat was consumed. But what was interesting, and of course there's a whole chapter behind this, but what was interesting in one sentence is that only 11 families were wealthy enough to offer an animal from their own herd, which they owned, for sacrifice. But everybody ate meat that day. Everybody in the village had some. And so this idea of first self-denial, to give up your favorite animal from the herd for sacrifice, to mimic the Abrahamic sacrifice, but also this commitment to redistribution, which is a very fundamental part of democratic politics. And the event I take from politics, of course, is an election itself, where that idea of inviolate commitment, which comes out of cultivation, is brought to elections in these villages, and indeed in large parts of India, where I proposed the thesis that elections in India are what I call sacrosanct. People think it unthinkable to not go and vote. And what creates that inviolate commitment is what I think about. But that participating in every election also and being participants in every election creates a completely different kind of solidarity between voters for that one day. But let me just go to the harvest to show you in a little bit more detail what an event like a harvest can generate, and why I make the claim that what it's generating is our democratic values. So this is a village like everywhere else in India that has extreme social inequality. There was decades of violence to bring in land reform by the communist government, and then there was redistribution of land. It was an incomplete project, but it managed to secure tenancy for some sharecroppers, and it raised the daily wage of agricultural workers. This forced the landowners to do manual work, right? And lower castes, of course, had much greater agricultural knowledge because they'd always worked in the fields. Upper castes had kept their distance from manual work. So the harvest, when it came around, had all this history behind it, this unequal distribution of land that had been redistributed. There was unequal distribution of agricultural knowledge, so you could have been high caste, high status, high class owners of land, but actually knew nothing about cultivation and how to make decisions during a harvest, when you've got to make decisions quickly and efficiently and manage labor across fields. What you saw, therefore, in a harvest, which it's a fleeting few days, it is a very generative moment, because what you get in these fleeting few liminal days is that all the other existing social divisions of caste and class, primarily, but even to a certain extent gender, are suppressed because there is a common activity. There is a common urgency to bring in the harvest before the rains come, or before the winds blow it away, or before it rots in the fields. So there is a suppression of agonisms to create solidarity. That's number one. Number two, there is this lack of social distinction. Literally, as I say, physically everybody's covered by paddy dust. But also, you can't tell who is upper caste, who is lower caste, because the people making decisions are often very low status people in society. And it creates, therefore, this rebalancing of hierarchies. This very important idea that the harvest introduces to everybody, which people actually echoed during an election was that, look, during a harvest, I may have one job, like this woman is just tying these stalks together. That's her job. But she knows that unless she ties the stalks together, there will be no large harvest at the end. There will be no pile of stalks of paddy. So this connection between your individual input and the final outcome of a collective good is established during a harvest. And people, when I said to them, when I talked to people who had missed out on voting for whatever reason, they were out of town, they couldn't get back in time, and there'd been tears, and I'd say, why does it matter? It's just one vote. And they said, don't you understand? The final result is the result of every single individual vote, and this result will not have my vote in it. So I am not invested in that result in the same way. I'm not connected to it in the same way. Now, this is a very powerful idea, I think, that comes out of agrarian life and this kind of activity. And therefore, this imagination of the common good that I've been talking about is very much present. So finally, to wrap up, I think just in time, is just to remind you that what I'm arguing here is that democracy and democratic values and democratic culture requires values, and these values are often created in non-political spaces, marriage and kinship, religious and economic life. The study of democracy, therefore, to my mind, needs attention, equal attention, both to its institutional framework, but also to its social organization and its culture, and that these values need continual cultivation. You can't stop cultivating. You can't say, I am tired, I am going to take a rest between these two elections, and next election, when we win it again, I will come back and continue to cultivate democracy. Well, by then, somebody else will be in power. There is no room for complacency. And this lack of complacency, of course, which in the political philosophy literature is that Machiavellian idea of virtue of active citizenship, of being a citizen who holds elected officials to account, that is vigilant about democratic institutions, about the need to continually cultivate those values, that you can't just introduce democratic institutions and expect democracy to emerge, that they need that everyday cultivation. That idea of active citizenship, I would argue, is exactly what I'm trying to capture through the metaphor and the practice of cultivation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was really wonderful and interesting. So we can go ahead and take questions from the room, sort of list. All right, I too, and then Marisa and Dinsha. And if you could please introduce yourselves first, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Aitu. I'm one of the postdocs at CDDR this year. Thank you very much for the very thought-provoking presentation. I want to ask, what type of a democratic institution or mechanism do you imagine at the village life? Like, what would you consider a democratic village, basically, and how do you observe that these events are contributing to the emergence of this democracy at the village level?
Well, I mean, this village is part of India. It has, a democratic institution. There are lots of democratic institutions, but there is local government. There's election at there are three tiers of democracy. It has 3 tiers of democratic officials to collect tax, to hold elections, to provide development, to do a host of different activities that the state does. And each of them, to a varying degree, requires the participation of citizens. Right? And so you see, it is no different in a village than studying it in a neighborhood in San Francisco. Wherever you're studying democracy, it is the interaction between institutions of the state, institutions of democratic mechanisms, and citizens, right? And that's exactly what you get in this village. So what I was saying, say, with the harvest and the relationship between individual effort and collective outcome is exactly how people saw their role in going to vote in an election, for instance. So that polling queue that I showed you of women standing in saris, that's a polling queue in the village itself. People turned up because they felt they had to be part of the democratic exercise that the country they live in practices every few years.
A really beautiful story of democracy in these villages that you tell. But I'm also interested in competition aspect of democracy, that we have to learn to respect others, differences. And so even if we don't agree, and so I'm wondering how these villages dealt with conflict, differences of values, and how that helped maybe support.
Yeah.
The importance of, when I think about the democratic values that we need today in this country, for example, I think that's one of them.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I think, if you think of Chantal Mouffe's writings on democracy, the agonistic core of democracy, as she calls it, I think it's the agonism of democracy that we normally write about a lot more. It is about competition. I think this is why we have a whole discipline devoted to electoral competition and results and margins and who did how well and records and so on, because it is ultimately about competition. What I'm trying to do two things. One is to say that it's not only competition. Politics is not only about competition. Politics is precisely, we say it's the art of compromise. It's also about being able to create solidarities, and in this, I think Hannah Arendt's take on politics is persuades me, because change is often brought in fact, through the creation of solidarities, and the creation of solidarity requires political work. What I show, the second point I make in this regard is to show that, what you do when you have somebody like the comrade absolutely dominating social life, political life, economic life, all aspects of everybody's lives. How do you get rid of it to reintroduce competition in a sense? The problem with that kind of dominance is that you're not having competition. Now, a very interesting fact, which, is a kind of fact that you pick up when you look at quantitative data, even as an anthropologist. None of my colleagues in anthropology, actually, not too many of them like quantitative data. But I looked at vote shares of all the parties in all the decades that the left front dominated for 34 years. What was interesting was that the Congress continued, the opposition party continued to poll 40% of the vote share. So people continued to vote for parties that was their parties, even though they knew they were not going to win. They continued to vote, and when I asked them about it, they said, yeah, you're not going to win, but A, that's my party, but B, it is important to keep other parties in the game because democracy is about multi-party competition. It's not about the dominance of one. So the scandal and the account of the scandal is able to show us how individuals and people act in a community to oust the comrade without killing him. So it's not like they plotted to assassinate him. They plotted to oust him through a series of maneuvers under great secrecy and at great risk, which was ultimately successful. So it's the need for solidarity in this case to renew the presence of competition.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. When I was listening, the material that I was thinking about in the back of my head, I guess, was probably from a generation that we don't talk about too much, but Barrington Moore, The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. You read that book. It's a great book, but you get to the India chapter, and this idea that no bourgeois, no democracy, it almost feels, it's the longest chapter in the book, and it just feels like he's trying to shove a round peg into a square hole or something like that. He's trying to grasp at straws to make his theory work. And a lot of people after that would write, sort of in the Gandhian tradition, how these villages sustain democracy in India in ways that Barrington Moore doesn't really get into. It seems like, from what you're arguing, you're following in that call it a Gandhian tradition, but obviously a lot of other political scientists also maintain it. The things that we would have to worry about then is perhaps, what Barrington Moore was hopeful of. There would be a bourgeois that would form in India, that people would get away from the villages, that would get away from harvesting. I'm just wondering how you would think about that, because we are seeing India move towards a middle class economic transformation. By going away from the village, is that why we're seeing perhaps a decline in democracy, as you alluded to, across India, or would you not say that?
I would tell that story slightly differently. Thank you for that question, actually, because it allows me to talk about a theme that I haven't mentioned, which I do talk about in the book. And I should just tell you that I couldn't hear you very clearly, but I think I got the gist of what you said. So correct me if I'm wrong, and do send me an email afterwards, because I would like to continue this conversation. Is that India, still 60% of India lives in villages, right? So yes, it's a very urban country and it's very high levels of urbanization. It's a very young country, but 60% of India still is rural. It's not all agrarian, but it is rural, right? There's a distinction. So that's number one. Number two is that the Gandhian story, so it's not going back, I'm not going back to that sort of village republic argument. But what I am going back to, you're absolutely right, is that when the Indian Constitution was being written, for instance, there was this real debate in the Constituent Assembly of where power should be located. And there were the communitarians like Gandhi, Radhakamal Mukherjee, Harold Lasky. I mean, it's a ragtag, it's a very interesting bunch of people on the one hand, and on the other is Ambedkar and Nehru, who otherwise disagreed on many things. But the one thing these two were convinced about was that, as Ambedkar said, and I'm sure you know, but Ambedkar was the great Dalit scholar. Actually, today's his birthday. Who was chaired the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution, but an exceptional scholar of law, economics, and who basically wrote the model of Indian democracy as it was adopted, influenced, I should say, by his favorite teacher, as he said by his own account, who was John Dewey in Columbia University, right? So a real Tocquevillian take on democracy as much as an institutional one. But Ambedkar, because he had, as an untouchable child in those days, coming from an untouchable caste, had faced severe discrimination in the village, and the family then left the village and moved to the city and so on. His idea of the village, famously, as he put it in his words, was that it was a den of vice. That somehow villages were backward, they were casteist, they were discriminatory, and therefore could not be trusted to be the repositories of democratic values. Now, I'm kind of arguing exactly against that and saying that if you actually spend some time in engaging with what's happening inside an Indian village, you find that the sources of democratic values, as I've been saying, are to be found there, which is not to say that they can't be found in urban India. I think you need some sense of community for them to grow. I think that's what is common. And that it is also not to say that it is some sort of egalitarian utopia that, that Ambedkar got wrong. No, there is huge amounts of social distinction in a way that there is huge amounts of social distinction and caste in urban India. It's not as if there's anywhere in India that is more it's not as if rural India is any worse than urban India in that sense. Not at all, to my knowledge. So the village then becomes, in some senses, I would say that it really stands in for a discussion of community. And it would be interesting to see if we can take this framework, and I'd love somebody to do that work, to see if this kind of argument can be made even in an urban neighborhood, and whether that would work.
Nick, and then Brett and Aisha. Sari.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Nick. I'm a pre-doc here at CDDRL. Thank you for the talk, by the way. You opened your talk with a sort of discussion of the broader picture in India with the BJP sort of underwriting democratic backsliding in India. In your study, that really interesting study was of these two villages that were predominantly Muslim. So I'm guessing places that didn't support the BJP. And so I'm wondering if you can say more about the changes in social life in places that do support the BJP and villages that do support the BJP, and if that looks different than the places that you describe in your study.
Well, it's certainly not in the book, because the book, as I said, ends in 2013, long before the BJP even enters the fray in any significant fashion in BJP in West Bengal. But I was there during the 2019 elections campaign, just before, and during the campaign, and it was very interesting that the people who were supporting the BJP, there was a generational story. There are very many ways. This is not just about Hindus and Muslims. It seemed to me that West Bengal has had this tension between left front supporters versus Congress supporters, who then became Trinamool supporters, right? So this has been a huge tension between these two. And the young men on motorcycles with red tilaks shouting Jai Shri Ram, which was really a code for their admiration for Prime Minister Modi, who could not articulate it quite so clearly as the others did for their parties, because they didn't know how well the BJP would do, because this wasn't the dominant party there. This was a generational story. This was a young generation that was saying the parents, they had seen their parents all their lives being caught in this tension between, are you a supporter of the Communist Party or are you not? And the BJP offered a third option. So that was one. It was very interesting that low caste Hindu women were beginning to move away again from the Communist Party. In rural in West Bengal was always the stronghold of the Communist parties, partly because of their land reform program. But these women supported their young men because it allowed them to emphasize. It brought them dignity, as Hindu women rather than as agricultural workers, which was their class position. So it allowed them to express a different identity. Now, when we look at 2021 and the results, and last year when we analyzed the results of West Bengal, we find that BJP played very interesting politics with mobilizing lower castes that hadn't been, caste had. One of the big mistakes and one of the big myths about West Bengal was that even though in the rest of India caste is important, in West Bengal caste is immaterial. This was the Communist Party message, because of course in communist ideology class matters above everything else. Now, this was complete nonsense, because if not anything else, if you look at the Politburo membership, it is entirely populated by upper caste men. There are no women in it, So Communist Party itself was an absolutely patriarchal upper caste institution, and lower castes were, simply. There's a story of the communists' relationship to caste which needs to be told, and that's being. And this is the story that the BJP was very effective in mobilizing in 2021. To get those votes. So it's a complex picture, which is not just to do with Hindu-Muslim, but also to do with caste, and a very interesting story about women. And here, Trinamool Congress and its female chief minister, right? This is the only state in India which has a woman in charge of all the 29 states. Now, Mamata Banerjee she's not just, we have lots of female politicians who do nothing for women's issues. Now, she's had a lot of welfare issues for women, but she's also had significant women in charge of campaigns and continues to do this. So it is a more feminist party than any other that we've ever seen in India. But the Prime Minister representing a certain kind of North Indian Hindu masculinity, which has actually paid him very well in garnering votes, performed that masculinity by openly at an election rally catcalling the chief minister. And this went down very badly. So it pushed back against, a lot of people felt that was a red line crossed. So all I'm saying in response to your question is that the BJP in West Bengal is, yes, it's about Hindutva and Hindu majoritarianism, but there's a complex story of generation, caste, and gender as well.
All right, Larry, do you want to go ahead and then Brett and Aisha?
No, go
All
on.
right, Brett.
Sure. So thank you very much for the presentation, which I enjoyed. So I particularly like the point where it was mentioned that democratic values can be created in non-political settings. That's fascinating. And then you talked about scandal and harvest and sacrifice and election as these sorts of spaces that could generate democratic values. But I guess I'm curious. One can imagine that each of those different moments could also generate conflict, right? Scandal election, elections rather than generating solidarity through participation could generate polarization and therefore some sort of cleavage across different interest lines. Harvest, rather than people learning together or learning to work together across divides could generate conflict over potentially scarcity. Sacrifice, maybe could generate religious conflict, right? Insofar as sort of differences within the community could be more salient. So I guess I'm kind of curious, why was it? What was it about maybe local conditions at the time that sort of kind of compelled these moments to generate democratic values rather than potentially pulling the society apart?
Okay, so I think
Actually, Aisha's saying that she has a related question, so go ahead.
Yes, very similar question. I would like to understand how we connect participation to social imaginaries of democracy. I mean, that connection is not very clear to me because sometimes participation really creates values and emotions that support anti-democratic politics. So I would like to understand how you, create that link. If we think of your intervention as a research agenda to study democratic culture in, let's say, urban settings, how do we sort of think of that link in participation and imagining?
okay. The first thing to say about, and I may be able to answer both questions at once, is when there's a slight technicality to this, to studying what I'm calling events. They are ritual moments in society, each of these. Sacrificing cattle, and if you read the book, you will, I'd write in a very vivid style so you can imagine yourself present. The kind of solemn silence that surrounds some of these ritualistic moments and rituals is what the technology of ritual achieves in any society. And this is something that anthropology and anthropologists have been very good at studying and contributing to our understanding of social organization. What, say, anthropologists of ritual have told us is that exactly what ritual does in any society is these are mechanisms to contain, express, and resolve conflict. That is precisely why rituals exist in society. So if you've had a really fractious faculty meeting, to be able to go and have a weekly drink in the bar at the end of it, is that ritualistic notion of it is precisely because you need a countervailing diffusing of conflict, right? Which is not to say that there is no conflict. Of course, like you say, there is conflict all the time. But the technology of ritual is precisely to create anti-structure. That's what ritual does. So when a cattle is sacrificed, there are rules about who you give the meat to, but one of the rules is also that you give a portion of the meat to everybody, regardless of what your relations are. So anyone you're connected through marriage, anyone you're connected through lineage, and anyone who you have worked with, which includes all the... Now, some of these relatives you may hate, you may absolutely sworn enemies, but the rules of ritual dictate that you follow them. And if you're doing the ritual properly, that's precisely what a ritual does. So it is not to deny that there is no conflict, but to take seriously what the function of the ritual is in society. And is to create values that we know we ought to have, and to actually make them desirable, as the anthropologist Joel Robbins says about, he's an anthropologist of Christianity and religion. So, the question of participation and social imaginaries of democracy, of course, you can be a participant in a riot, and that's not a social imaginary of democracy. It's not just participation, it is participation in an activity that is about creating a common good, about suppressing hierarchy. It is about what it is that you're participating in is actually quite significant. If you are participating in a lynch mob, that's not about creating, it's not about any of the things that I've just outlined. But, you said something which made me think that the other point that we don't make often, and I think we need to, is even for what we might call the liberal project or liberal politics, we are much less attentive to the affect or the affective register of liberal politics. We know that the politics of hate, what we saw on the 6th of January on Capitol Hill in the US last year, was the emotion of anger and hate and complete lawlessness. So we associate emotion to be an aspect of hate-filled, undemocratic, right-wing politics. But liberal politics too has its emotions. And we need to think about how one can actually generate and encourage those emotions a lot more, where being part of a silent moment where you remember everybody who has got together in building a brick kiln before you light it, for instance. That's another one of those little mini rituals that has in the village. People are quite emotional, they're choked up about that because it is the material manifestation of 100 days of work by 35 people together. And that is also an emotional moment. And I think we need to be attentive to those emotions too.
Great. All right, final question, Larry.
I wonder if we could unpack democracy a little further. There are all the elements you've been talking about in terms of participation, self-determination, obviously elections, mobilization, community decision-making and engagement, and so on. And a lot of that requires or benefits from liberal values, tolerance, and so on. But then there are the other ways that Narendra Modi and the BJP are kind of assaulting and diminishing liberal democracy in India, such as it has existed, that I am trying to understand to what extent Indian villagers who deeply value all of the democracy as participation and self-determination elements will care about. Such as freedom of the press, such as judicial independence, such as academic freedom, things that may be very abstract to and remote from the daily lives and rituals of these villagers. So is there any connection between democratic village life that you saw in India and these dimensions of liberal democracy that are under assault? Or is there any strategy that you can imagine that might move them, even in the emotional sense you just spoke of, to care about, want to defend those more remote but liberal aspects of democracy?
Thank you for that question. I mean, it is, I think this is the question, right? I should make a very important clarification though. I'm not just talking about, by talking about a village, I'm not talking just about villagers and their attachment to democracy. I'm talking about the possibility, because it's a village, the scale is intimate enough for us to look at what goes into creating the attachments to democracy. And therefore, this is then representative of studying the mechanics anywhere else. This is not particular to the village. That's number one. And therefore, when you say, do these villagers care? What I was trying to say, and there wasn't really enough time, with the comrade, for instance, is that there too you see a complete understanding that if you have been a participant in a democratic project for nearly 75 years, as Indians have anywhere in India, there is also this sense that, this is this far and no further. And remember, 36% of India votes for Narendra Modi. Not everybody does. And there are large parts of India where the BJP doesn't win votes. So it's not as if everybody is completely in the thrall of this party and this man. The third thing to say to your question is, this, I say at the preface to my book that it has been a privilege to study Indian democracy while it existed. It's a very sad thing to say. Not because I don't support the BJP, which I don't, but because the very institutional framework, as you have just said, but whether it is the media, whether it is the judiciary, whether it is the election commission, all of these have been distorted and captured. So to my mind, it has done, I think the BJP has been absolutely masterminded. They've masterminded the capacity to keep the veneer of democracy so they get invited by President Biden to the club of democracies, but hollowed it out of meaning. They have been absolutely skillful in doing this. This is the problem. This is exactly, and so what they've done with elections, for instance, the fact that 96% of electoral bonds money goes to one political party means that they're not buying votes. They have just saturated the public sphere with images and messages and WhatsApp forwards of any message, whether they're lies. 1 million people died in Uttar Pradesh, in India's biggest state, that went to the polls last month, and the BJP won a resounding victory, as you know, I'm sure. But that's not because people think it's all right that 1 million people died. It's because they have been drip, drip, drip on a daily basis through a vast deployment of resources, saturated with a message that the ruling party wants them to believe. That is, to my mind, that is a complete breakdown of democratic culture. And the challenge, therefore, is to think of what the resources are from where any fight back would come to that kind of capture of democracy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Banerjee, for joining us. Thanks for this fantastic project and book, and thank you all of you for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thanks.